I've long anticipated coming to visit BYU. How is a psychology and a theology of thriving helpful when people are surviving? So I love holding up in healthy spirituality, there are a variety of practices that enable us to become more connected and to become more whole. And that when we become whole, when we become ourselves, when we thrive, that we will contribute to a greater whole like BYU.
Good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming out on this snowy, horrible night. My big phobia is falling. And so the fact that you even walked in here into the Hinckley Center in the snow means you're a very impressive person to me. So we thank you and congratulate you for coming out tonight. My name is Michaela Dufer. I'm an Associate Dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and I happen to chair the Marjorie P. Hinckley Endowed Chair Advisory Committee. So it's my privilege tonight to welcome you to the 21st Annual Marjorie P. Hinckley Lecture. We're so excited to have you here. We're so pleased to have so many of Sister Hinckley's family, friends with us tonight, members of our President's Council and our college's National Advisory Council, our faculty, our staff, and most especially our students who managed to come here in the snow tonight. We're so grateful to have all of you, and we extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Maya Jackson, who's a Master of Social Work student, will now offer an opening prayer for us. As many of you know, and from looking at the program, the Marjorie P. Hinckley Endowed Chair funds not only this lecture, which is very special to us, but also supports students in internships with travel funds to participate in academic conferences where they present the research they've done. It helps to provide faculty with mentoring and research grants, and also supports an annual social work conference that I believe last year provided education and training to more than 350 social workers from around the area. So we're so grateful to all of the generous donors who've contributed to this endowment and make all of those amazing activities possible. We are so honored to have the Reverend Dr. Pamela Ebstyne King here with us tonight to speak on matters that I think were very close to Sister Hinckley's heart, and of course are very resonant with the things that we care about here at BYU. To introduce Dr. King tonight, we have Sam Hardy, a professor in our psychology department, who has collaborated with Dr. King. Sam?
Good evening. I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight. So Dr. Pamela Ebstyne King is the Peter L. Benson Professor of Applied Developmental Science at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. She's also the director of the Thrive Center for Human Development. She has her bachelor's in psychology, my field, from Stanford. And then she did her Master's of Divinity at Fuller Theological Seminary, her PhD in Marriage and Family Studies at Fuller, and then a postdoc at Stanford. And while she was in her postdoc at Stanford, that's when I met her. I was in grad school at Nebraska with Laura Walker. And so that was 2001. So I've known her. She's one of the first people in the field I met at my first conference as a grad student. So we're in the same field, so I can speak authoritatively about her role in the field. So for 2 decades, she's basically been a pioneer in the field, building the field of adolescent religious and spiritual development. She's published some of the earliest and most highly cited books and chapters on the subject, and also published a lot of journal articles in top-notch journals. And I would think of her as pretty much the leader in the world as far as spirituality research, spiritual development, so we're privileged to have her here. Let's see, she also hosts a podcast that's fairly new the last few years on this kind of topic, spirituality and thriving, called With and For, so check that out. In addition to her academic work, she's a wife, a mother of 3, and an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. And she's actually one of my favorite people in the field, so I'm so excited to finally have her here to BYU. So welcome, Pam King.
Marjorie's words of low expectations are ringing throughout me right now. The bar has been set high and emotions are high. What a beautiful video. Lizzie, your words, I feel very humbled and honored to be stepping into this podium and offering words in Marjorie's honor. What a beautiful woman she sounds like. Things that captured me that you said or I heard that resonate with much of my research and work is her desire to serve and her delight in people. And she sounded like just a delightful spark plug of a person and deeply faithful, and her appreciation of dignity of all people. That is something that has been very resonant in my work from both theological and psychological perspectives. So I'm very honored to be here. I'm a little intimidated by that introduction, Sam. Thank you. I also add that I've long anticipated coming to visit BYU. I've had the honor of collaborating with many folks, from Dave Dolahite to Sam, Janae, and Laura, and others. And Dave was in getting me, I was going to come, and then there was this thing called COVID. So everything shut down. And then, if you can believe it, I live about a mile and a half from the Eaton fires, which you've probably heard about in the last month in Los Angeles. So I thought, what is with these BYU invitations and disasters? But we prevail. We are here, and I'm thrilled. And actually, I'll just start by saying well, no, I won't start by that. Well, yes, I will. Here we are. So I run something called the Thrive Center. And in talking to some of my colleagues here, I've heard a few of you comment about public scholarship. And that is something that at this stage in my career, I have shifted a bit of energy to and run something called the Thrive Center for Human Development, where we not only do research and collaborate with extraordinary researchers around the pressing questions around spiritual development, spiritual health, and human thriving, but we're also creating resources to enable people to thrive and understand how to engage spirituality and faith more deeply in their lives. And that's been really energizing for me, but that's just a bit about my heart and the Thrive Center. And as part of that, one of the resources that I've been working on is this podcast called Within Four. And this is just shameless self-promotion here. So, and you have a card on that too. But the fires have been very poignant for me, and I probably don't want to get too much into it because it can get quite emotional. My home is safe, my neighborhood is safe, but most of my friends, my pastor, my spiritual director have all lost their homes or have been evacuated and probably will never be able to return to their homes, but are living in this chaos of liminality, of not knowing where they're sleeping next week. It's really hard to find a rental right now in the area, and we have the Palisades people moving over to our side of town, so it's very complicated. And here I am, a scholar who studies thriving, and the people closest to me are really working on surviving. And I have been challenged to feel rather irrelevant, or not just like that I care that I'm irrelevant, but like, how is a psychology and a theology of thriving helpful when people are surviving? And I found it actually is, as I actually heard in the video, Marjorie sounded like she was I should say Sister Hinckley, forgive me. And I will probably say things I'm not supposed to say, so let's just clear that. Like, I have been known to do that in circles I'm more familiar with, so forgive me. We'll just get that confession over with right now. But people are not necessarily thriving nationwide, and particularly college students and adolescents are getting a lot of press for mental health issues and a mental health crisis. And I know we've heard tons about technology as a culprit. We've heard tons about loneliness and lack of connection. Michaela was just sharing with me about, is it BYU 101? Yeah, a new course that helps students on-ramp into university life, building connections, and this is all really fine and well. But I would say that my research is also suggesting that we're not just suffering a mental health crisis, but our nation is also suffering a spiritual health crisis. And at this point, so many people in the U.S. are not necessarily rooted in a faith tradition or a religious tradition and really struggle around areas of meaning and purpose and a sense of ultimate belonging. And now I'm going to anticipate I'm somewhat preaching to the choir here in that is all. There are practices and beliefs that you have that are well versed in what I will describe to you as spiritual health. But I'm very sensitive to the reality that many of the young people in our country today are growing up without a lot of the resources that we have. I connect quite a bit with university chaplains, actually more at secular universities than Christian universities, and they are talking about how irrelevant they feel that young people aren't attending chapel or seeking out religious support unless there's like a massive catastrophe. They say that's when they come and find us. But those that are finding traction on campuses are raising up issues of meaning and helping young people find out, like, and reflect on what truly matters. So I think understanding how our faith and our spirituality, our religious traditions and community can bring psychological resources to us is really important. And yes, so there is this shift in the religious and spiritual landscape in the US of people definitely reporting being less religious. Their affiliation is decreasing, and I don't know that that is true in the Latter-day Saints. But that is in many other religious traditions. And more people are identifying as being spiritual but not religious. So I will just, as a disclaimer, say, as a psychologist and social scientist, I use the word spiritual and I use the word religious. And in this context, they're pretty synonymous. There are moments where people are seeking issues of meaning and transcendence outside of the context of religion, but and tonight I'm really talking about how people find how they experience their spirituality within the religious context. So my hopes tonight are twofold, is to highlight the psychological resources that are available to us in healthy forms of spirituality to enable people to thrive or to become whole. I find people feel a lot of pressure, like, oh my gosh, now I've got to flourish, I've got to thrive. What do we need to do that? But what I'm really talking about is enabling people to become whole, to become themselves. And so in that, I somewhat made two assertions, which some people are not always comfortable with. And the first is that if we're talking about healthy spirituality, that assumes that some versions of spirituality are not as healthy. So I want to talk a bit about that. I'm going to draw a bit more on psychological research broadly to inform that conversation. And that also that there might be a notion of thriving that is definable. I don't know if I'd go as far to say objective, but I do think we can assess it. So, but we'll get there in due time. So I drew on, forgive me, I lost my place. I'm kind of free. I had a computer catastrophe today. So forgive me for a moment. Drawing on President C. Shanes Reese's quote that in my little research prepare about BYU, that he said in his inauguration, "Our task is to become the university that prophets have foretold, the BYU of prophecy and promise. This great goal will not be obtained in exactly the same way that other universities have achieved their greatness. This then is our challenge during my administration, is becoming BYU." And as a psychologist before you, deeply immersed in issues of spirituality and faith, I want to say that I believe a path of becoming BYU is becoming you. And that when we become whole, when we become ourselves, when we thrive, that we will contribute to a greater whole like BYU. Now, before you might think I'm a renegade, like self-actualizing, self-absorbed, or championing that, I want you to know that the name of the podcast is With and For, and that I ultimately believe that thriving happens with and for others and with and for God. So this becoming you is not about narcissistic navel-gazing, but I think it is a pathway of becoming whole, coming fully alive, and contributing to a greater whole, and ideally enabling becoming you to become a pathway to becoming BYU. Oh, I already spilled. The podcast is Thriving is Becoming with and for others. With and for is actually a Jesuit statement that I have borrowed, and I have very ecumenical leanings in my understanding, and I really appreciate that notion of with and for. But I wanted to share a bit about just my personal background. I grew up in a Presbyterian church in Evanston, Illinois, if you are familiar with the Chicago area. I was a part of the youth group. Being in Chicago, churches had basements. They, of course, put the teenagers in the basement with the old used couches. And I remember being in, we called it the pit, down there, and our youth pastor talking about John 10:10 and talking about how Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it in the fullest. And somehow, I think around my 15-year-old brain, like that resonated. And it actually began to detonate in me, like, wow, full life, whether you're abundant life, full life. I'm like, what is that? And how does one have it? And at that point, I had a conversion experience in middle school. So I was like on the path to dedicating my life to God. But I was like, what is that? And I was pretty optimistic by disposition. I loved being a Glenbrook South Titan. And Ferris Bueller went to Glenbrook North, just so you know, for any of you in that era. But we had a big story about being Titans and who we were, and I thought that was awesome. But I'm like, this life in the fullest is bigger than being a Titan. I think it's even bigger than being a Presbyterian, and honestly, that's not hard. We are known as God's frozen chosen, so in the Protestant denomination. But it really set me on a journey that I actually take up in theology in grad school, and then I was like, this is not enough. I need to understand human change and growing into this fullness from a psychological perspective. So that's really been a drive for me. I will say, so Fuller Seminary identifies as an evangelical Protestant seminary. We're multi-denominational. But my experience in evangelicalism in that part of the church has been often that we emphasize more about what Jesus saves us from. So sin and death, and we're so grateful for salvation to be saved from hell and sin and all these bad things. And I don't want to diminish that. That's huge. But there's a part of me that was like, is that what God intended for humans? Was like just to survive and to just be saved from something? Or were we actually saved for something? And my psychology has described that as thriving. So I don't believe that we are designed just to survive, but we are designed to thrive and become fully alive as ourselves. So as I said, Jesus saved us from death, and that is so great. And I believe he saved us to become fully alive. And I think when we do that, when you become you, that contributes to becoming BYU. I also heard in Marjorie, and I'm going to take that parenting note, when in doubt, save the relationship. That's a really good word. Relationality is very important to how I understand our faith journey and how I understand our human nature. And I often talk about reciprocity, but I want to unpack that a bit and ask, what is thriving? So if you look in Webster's dictionary, which is somewhat reliable, thriving is referred to as vigorous growth. And that's invigorating. I'm like, who doesn't want growth? Unless it's, there are some bad ways to grow, actually. If you grow in deceit, in lying, like that might be a skill for some people, and people might classify that under resourcefulness, but generally, I'm gonna say there's consensus in this room that growing in the capacity to lie and deceit is maybe not indicative of thriving. So what I suggest is that thriving is actually growing purposefully, growing towards our purpose. There is a beautiful Greek word in the New Testament, telos. And telos refers to, or is Greek for wholeness, or purpose, or completion, and sometimes perfection. So the notion of telos is the ultimate purpose that humans are created for. So what are humans like when they are completed? Not in this life, but on the other side of eternity. And I believe that thriving is our journey of growing towards God's purposes for us. Well, that's great. And I was all on board for yeah, my purpose is to glorify God. Well, okay, well, if we all have that purpose, that's not terribly specific. And how do we understand more what our path of thriving or our purpose might be? Very important to my theological upbringing has been that as Christians, we are called to be conformed to Christ. We are called to be more Christ-like. And so that means we take on the character of Christ, we follow the ways of Jesus and his actions of caring for the poor and the marginalized, of accepting and forgiving and bringing healing. And so that something about thriving is becoming more Christ-like. And I think I was grilling Sam a bit on the way here and asking about what are the two inheritances, did I say that right? The two inheritances of BYU, of both the commission to excel in one's field or discipline academically, but also, I'm using the word commission, to be distinct and to be informed by the prophecies and the teachings. And for me, part of thriving is to be informed by your spiritual and religious and moral ideals. And often in the US, when we talk about well-being or flourishing or thriving, it's often about like becoming your best self, developing your strengths. That is awesome. But we're also tied to this moral mandate of becoming more Christ-like. And I think that's part of BYU's mission, is becoming distinct persons because of our beliefs. But we might be called to conformity with Jesus, but not uniformity. So we're not all called to become like Jesus in the same way. And that's great because then we'd have really like everyone would be a psych professor, because that's my orientation. Or we'd all be amazing tech guys like Tom, who is going to save my computer. I just know it. No pressure, Tom. I'm just kidding. But no. But part of the thriving journey is growing into one's uniqueness and individuality, and growing into one's strengths and pursuing one's passions. I am not going to talk a lot about it tonight, but I do a lot of work in the area of joy. And I truly believe that humans experience joy when we live with integrity those ideals that I was talking about, and also when we do the things we delight in. So I was somewhat asking Laura at dinner about her experience as dean and what she enjoys about that and how much she loves connecting with the many faculty and staff. And when there's only so much time in a day, knowing what's really brings us joy and what's part of our calling is really helpful in discerning how we spend our time. But I will also add that we're not just about becoming our individual selves, like inherent to who we are. That's the unique self, is our relationality, that we are deeply related to one another. Theology suggests that, and psychology proves that out. Without relationships, people actually die, babies die, they don't thrive, they don't develop well. And so being the roles that we play in our life are important in addition to our goals and in addition to that soul work that we do also. And so when we think about purpose or telos, and I love, again, Marjorie's example, it's not just about a job, but it's also about the relationships in our life. Those people who we care for, those people who care for us, those people who we know and we love. And so to wrap that up, I would say this telos, this P, capital P purpose, this grand purpose for us as humans lies at this intersection of becoming ourselves like Christ and with and for others. And I think that is a powerful way of thinking about pursuing your own developmental journey. Well, life throws us quite a few challenges, and it can be really hard to become whole and become yourself. And I am really grateful that we have religious traditions and faith experiences and faith communities that provide resources for growing into that sense of purpose. And so I want to turn to that now. I know the faculty that I've met with do a lot of this research and are well-versed in the findings that show that religion and spirituality are so often associated with decreased depression, with decreased anxiety, decreased violence in young people, decreased amounts of substance abuse and suicide. Like, that's all good. But that's the absence of negative things. But spirituality and faith are also associated with increased resilience, hope, life satisfaction, and meaning and purpose. Now, the stats aren't always clean. We were talking today about in certain conditions, these things don't bear out for all people, but generally so, we know that faith is a great resource for thriving for people. But it's not a panacea. Not all experiences of spirituality or faith bear out. And what's very exciting is that when I started, as Sam was saying, I finished my doctorate in 2000, that there was not a lot of research in these areas on how faith was connected to our psychological lives, our well-being. But since then, there has been like 2.5 decades of research, thank you to people in this room, who really demonstrate not just that these relationships exist, but why they exist, what it is about faith that helps people do well in life. And one of the things I like to emphasize in my work is that thriving is not just about our individuality, but when people thrive, they're enabling other people to thrive. And so spirituality should not just enable our own individual life, but it should enable us to contribute to the broader community and world. I've worked to devise the spiritual health framework that I'll share with you in a moment because I want to highlight practical resources for people of faith, for students of faith who are like, I'm struggling, or I'm trying to figure out my purpose or my vocation. How can I engage my faith more effectively to do this? And also for clinicians and therapists, you just had a conference on social work and in integrating faith and spirituality into the practice of social work for people in ministry and other forms of frontline workers. So here is the spiritual health framework that is backed by existing research that this is, stretch your imaginations with me, it's a lens. That maybe was not the first thing that came to mind. But imagine a lens that you might have, there's 6 facets that you might look through. And I'm gonna walk through the 6 facets represent different bodies of research that suggest how, and Sam did an extraordinary paper, but and myself and another student, that really demonstrate a lot of these mediating relationships. So the first one, and if you didn't notice, it spells thrive, and you have a card on your seat that actually has this depicted, if that's helpful for you. But the first one for T is a word that I find psychologists like to use and doesn't always go fly well in religious circles, but we're going to try it anyways, and that is transcendence. So psychologists or social scientists will often talk about how do different people experience transcendence, whether it's through the relationship with God. Some people might say nature if they don't believe in God. I've done studies on spiritually exemplary youth, and one of the agnostic Jewish young people talked about how being connected with the covenant people of God, the Jewish people distributed throughout the world, was a really important experience of transcendence for him, and how he would go to synagogue every Saturday because it allowed and facilitated this connection to his people. And I've had some beautiful conversations today in asking how in the LDS tradition do people experience transcendence? And for me, it was just really eye-opening and very heartening and encouraging to hear about what transpires within the temple and how that is a place where people meet God, experience God, connect with those past and present, and very extraordinary experiences. And I love that set apart, sanctified space that is a place where people can experience that which is beyond them. From a psychological perspective, I want you to know this is really important. When people experience transcendence, when they are inspired, when they have experiences of elevation is a word we use in psychology. This does great stuff for your brains. It actually relaxes your brain and enables you to be more open to things like creativity or new ideas. So experiencing the love of God is powerful. We know that spiritually, but I just want to tell you, psychologically, it's good stuff. So also, the different and broader perspective it can give you in life is really important. And when I think about this issue of thriving, of how we're individuals and how we're a part of something bigger, I think often of a tapestry. And I don't know if you've ever been, a favorite experience of mine was going to the Bayou, seeing the Bayou tapestries in northern France or seeing some other medieval tapestries in France. And I can't imagine doing them. I'm so glad we have machines to weave things like these chairs. But people took individual threads, and I see each of us as an individual thread. And when we are woven into a bigger story, it creates an extraordinary landscape and picture. And our lives take on a lot more meaning than they would as just an individual thread. I mean, Jordan, that's a beautiful dress, and that is your color, or those are your colors, and that would be great, but it's more beautiful a part of a bigger tapestry. And so our lives having some sense of transcendence, of being a part of something bigger, gives our lives meaning. And going back to that uniqueness, that tapestry doesn't work without each of your threads, right? So they all matter. They may not always be distinct, but they make that up. So being a part of something bigger is very powerful, psychologically, and obviously very important to our traditions. The second letter is H, for habits and rhythms. And that is a little bit forced, but that really refers to spiritual practices and rhythms. And we all have different practices, whether prayer, the beautiful prayers that have been offered tonight, practices of fellowship, of coming together and eating, practices of service. Today at lunch, we talked about how transformational mission experiences are for young people. I had a mission experience, or a few, but they're so much shorter and smaller in my religious world, extremely impactful on me, but I can't imagine 18 months or 2 years. This is a great thing that you all do. But these traditions, these practices are so formative to people. And what's extraordinary is we have a choice of what practices we take on. We can all sit, on our phones all day, and we know what that does to our brains, to our attention span, to our relationships. We can spend time in silence. We can spend time connecting, talking to people, working through hard issues. These are all practices that transform us and that we need, and they help us thrive. So I love holding up in healthy spirituality, there are a variety of practices that enable us to become more connected and to become more whole. So then the R, I think this is an LDS all-star strength, is relationships and community. We are relational people, and you all do relating really, really well. The emphasis on family, on beliefs that aren't necessarily have not been mined, but the connection to ancestors and those who have gone before us are so powerful. It's a whole nother form of transcendence. But so much about how people transform is when they are loved, whether the love of God or that love that we experience through other people. And investing in that is so important. So healthy forms of spirituality actually do value relationships and community. And this is maybe not an important point for this room, but when you are talking to average American young person, they're spiritual and not religious because they don't want to be tied down to a community or showing up on Sunday morning or Wednesday night, whenever that is. But that showing up and being with people is so important to who we are. I'd love you to each think for a moment of people in your life who've been transformative to you, whether it was a mentor. I forgot the term that you shared, that you have a minister assigned to you, a sibling, a parent, a grandmother, maybe a historic exemplar, someone you didn't know, but that has been an example for you or an encouraging presence for you. Those relationships really matter. And so as you're thinking about encouraging people that are coming up in the faith, encouraging them to pursue relationships and community is really important. The next letter is identity and narrative, and I dedicate this to Sam Hardy, who's studied a lot about moral identity. This is one that doesn't always come up in religious circles, though I heard two presidents ago, Dave Dolehite talked about the importance of spiritual identity for LDS tradition. And our identity of who we are really matters, and that's that uniqueness. A lot of religious traditions emphasize more conformity, of these are the rules, do it, This is what qualifies you. But don't necessarily celebrate the uniqueness, not just the good stuff and the strengths, but those particularities and maybe annoying habits that my husband could tell you about in my case. But that makes us a whole person, and that is part of our identity. And it's part of our identity as God's beloved. If we were perfect and just had strengths, God's love really wouldn't matter that much to us. But the fact that God shows up for us and is with us despite those foibles, those potentially, honestly, diagnosable issues, God still loves us, right? And that is so important. And so that identity and narrative piece is so vital, especially to young people, because so many young people are trying to figure out who they are and whose they are. Like, who do they belong to? So again, when we can help young people understand that their lives are woven into a bigger tapestry that has so much meaning, that is so helpful for young people. And religious traditions are great for doing that. Also, religious traditions offer wonderful beliefs around redemption and wholeness and flourishing. And those beliefs are really important to uphold. And to also uphold how people can redeem their narratives, that we think in psychology of a narrative as your ongoing story you tell about your life. So guess what? My narrative changes tonight. I've been to BYU. Haven't done that before. I've deepened friendships. I have new ideas. So our narratives, our lives, our identities are always morphing, but always coming back to God's beloved is such an important place to be. So the V, maybe one of my favorites, is vocation and purpose. And this goes back to that telos that I was talking about. Religious traditions are awesome for giving people a task, for giving them a purpose. We use the word calling or vocation. Not many people have a sense of calling on their life. I have been so thrilled to hear about discernment processes and lots of preparation that goes on for missions and subsequently. In my tradition, you don't even hear the word tradition unless you go to seminary, which is a graduate school after you go to college in the Protestant tradition. But having a tradition that helps people discern that in community can say, you have that gift. You are great at managing things. You make beautiful stuff. Having a community that can help you name your gifts is so very helpful. And I'm guessing your grandmother did a lot of that for you all, since you all were her favorite. I love that. I love that. I wanted to think maybe I'd have been her favorite too if I was her granddaughter. So vocation and purpose. The last one is also one that I've collaborated a bit with my BYU colleagues on, is ethics and virtues. And this, people are like, okay, it's a long model, Pam. Isn't 5 enough? Why do you need ethics and virtue? Nobody wants to hear about the moral life or ethics and virtue, which is why we've had to study it, because being pro-social and being moral is not always the most popular, most funded thing to study. But our faith traditions give us guideposts how to live. And this is so helpful. People today have so many options. Young people are paralyzed about choices, not just what to do, what to become, but how to act, what's okay. We live in this crazy polarized world that really is vying for very extreme ends of attention. And when you're part of a faith tradition that gives you an evolving and clarifying sense of ethics, that is just, it frees up bandwidth. Like, imagine your brain as RAM. You get more RAM freed up to do creative and good and joyful things if you have a more clarified sense of what your beliefs and ethics are. I love a good metaphor, and I'm kind of known for pushing them perhaps over the edge, but let me try this on you. Going back to the tapestry in the loom, I was wondering if the structure of the loom that you weave threads into might be our beliefs. And because they give structure. And I was thinking in our religious beliefs, our doctrines, but also our ethical beliefs. And when they're malformed, the picture's not so beautiful. So I don't know if that works, but our moral beliefs are really important, not just to being religious and checking boxes, but really to who we are and to becoming whole. Out of COVID, some really extraordinary research on moral injury came out of when people had to violate their sense of moral, or having to choose people who were saved and not, was very, like saved from a health perspective, not religious perspective, was very challenging. Soon after the fires were extinguished, or almost extinguished, at least residentially, I spoke with the fire chief at a local gathering, and he was almost in tears talking about that homes burnt on his watch. And secondly, how hard it was on the first responders to have to choose which homes to put out and not. A friend of mine at 2 a.m. was evacuating her home with her family, and her neighborhood was ablaze, and there were firemen there, and they got in their trucks, and her neighbor called out and said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "We've been ordered to save JPL. The fire is moving that way." JPL is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that created the Mars Observatory, many of our satellites, and many of our rockets, and is like a national scientific resource that just happens to be where we were. And the woman said, "And you're going to leave us and our homes to burn." And the guy couldn't meet her eyes and drove away. But the toll that takes on you when you violate your morals and ethics is really hard. So our morals are really important to thriving. And so that piece of the 2 inheritances of becoming BYU, of being excellent in your discipline and your profession, and also living with that distinctiveness of your beliefs, is really crucial to thriving. So when I say becoming you, it's not just that, be your best self and do self-care, which I think is really important, but people often take it superficially, but that it is really, really deep work. So there it is all together. And we have a website, and we have practices and different research associated with those if you're interested. And I know we have a lot of mental health associated folks in this audience, and I wanted to share with you some of the reasons I get excited about an orientation around spiritual health is that often in mental health, we have a deficit orientation. So mental health is actually diagnosable things like anxiety. Regrettably, we don't have more notions of flourishing and thriving. We are coming up with well-being, but people tend to focus on curing symptoms. A spiritual health perspective really offers an asset orientation of looking at people's strengths and looking at people's the environments around them. And I know in social work are so well poised to understand the ecological assets that people have or don't have in their lives. So we move from this just focusing on symptoms to more focusing on this telos and fullness of life, where it's not individually oriented, which often therapy can be very individually oriented, but spiritual health really also focuses on the systems and the communal. Often mental health practitioners aren't versed in accessing people's religious beliefs and resources, where in this orientation obviously do. And often in mental health, people need to be licensed to be able to provide care. Whereas in this notion of spiritual health, spiritual practitioners, people of faith, can help activate these resources to those people in their life. So I hope that you will find that empowering in a way that you can come alongside people who are on the road to thriving or may want to be thriving or not. So I hope that is encouraging for you. And I just want to share, and by sharing that my time here has been one of discovery of this beautiful tapestry that LDS has provided. And I love seeing how my colleagues are just such thoughtful, excellent, kind, caring, great collaborators, and I get where they come from. Like, it just makes a lot of sense. And I thank you so much for coming out in this nasty evening of weather. I want to wish you well in your own individual and collective shared journeys of thriving, and hope that as you go out, you will see new opportunities in ways that you can become more whole and become more you and find joy in that and contribute to the greater collective. Thank you so much.
Well, what a gift Pam is, what a gift her wisdom has been. What a gift to have friends of BYU who are like, I want to send you scriptures.
Yeah, I love that, right?
We're going to send stories back and forth to each other.
Yeah.
In return, we have a tiny little gift for you that we want to give you. We'll let you not unwrap. You'll just have to take it out of the bag here. We can tell you the story of where it comes from.
Oh my gosh.
Over to you.
Wow. And you want me to open this now?
Sure.
Okay. Wow.
Well, and partially so you can say if you need us to mail it to you rather than put it in your bag.
Oh my goodness. Wow. It's beautiful. Oh my goodness. What a gorgeous.
So this is actually, there are a monument to women in Nauvoo, Illinois, which, to make a long story short, is an important stopping place for the early Latter-day Saints before they came to Utah and kind of on their way to Utah. And so they have several statues toward the women who were trailblazers, and that's you. You're a trailblazer in these spiritual matters.
Thank you. That's so meaningful. Thank you. That's, wow. Oh, thank you.
Very well done. If you need us to mail it, we can mail it.
Okay.
If it won't fit in your bag.
Thank you. I've been given so many goodies. BYU mugs. I'm going back armed and I'm going to be like your West Coast ambassador.
I told her earlier, you have to take some brownies home. We're famous for the brownies.
Yes. When I'm up all night after eating brownies. But I'll close by saying something that has really touched me since I've been here. Janae and I were talking, I was talking about a paper that I wrote on virtue in theological systems. I love lip gloss, but I am a nerd. Is the importance of material in religious life. And I think like the fires have really jogged my like understanding of often like discrediting like, oh, home is where the heart is. But the material world can be very sacred for us. And when in talking the discussions about the holiness and specialness, the transcendence of the temple, maybe really appreciate like that physical space for you. And so this is very meaningful as a physical object and reminiscent of a place. So thank you. I'm very touched by that.
Thank you. Let's give another round of applause for the Reverend Doctor.
Thank you.